today, who for most of you probably needs no introduction. That is Peter Wattson. Peter is a longtime staffer with the Minnesota Senate, several decades of experience, and Peter is now that he is retired, has switched sides and is now a plaintiff in the redistricting battles of the 2020s. And he's going to walk through some of the work that he's been doing and the draft maps for Minnesota, just to give you an idea of what the thinking is when you are addressing a new redistricting cycle in a new state, for those of you who haven't done it before. So without further ado, Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ben, for that kind introduction. And thanks to all of you who have been willing to come and listen to me talk about maps and reports. I'll show you what I'm using to explain first to the Minnesota legislature and then to the state court the congressional and legislative plans that I am proposing and how they comply or don't comply with the set of districting principles that I am proposing that the court adopt. This set of maps that we'll be taking a look at here in just a moment is different from the set attached to my complaint in February. Those maps were based on 2018 population estimates and included no information about incumbent residences or election results. These maps are based on 2019 population estimates and have lots of information about incumbents and election results. I'm going to turn now to my computer and share my screen with you. I hope this works. I got to move this out of the way. I think I'm in the wrong. Okay, now can everybody see a page that says districting principles at the top?
I can see it.
Okay. These are the principles that I included as an exhibit attached to my complaint. I need to get this out of the way. I got a message that this meeting is being recorded. Continue. Okay. I've attached these principles to my complaint, and they are based on the court's principles from 10 years ago, but modified to take advantage of the changes in redistricting law that other states have made via constitutional amendment and court decisions since 2012. If you take a look at the subjects here, you'll see they're kind of garden variety. You probably have something like this in your state. Population equality, minority representation, convenience, contiguity, political subdivisions, compactness. And then we come to something that is new. There's been a lot of discussion in the Minnesota legislature this year about making a greater effort to not divide American Indian reservations more than is necessary. And so I thought it would be appropriate to just add a principle dealing with the Indian reservations. The communities of interest language is pretty much the same as the court has been using for the last several decades, minor tweaks based on work that other people have done. The court has always said something about incumbents. It said, oh, we're not going to look at incumbent residences when we're drawing our plans, but when we're done, we're going to take a look and to see if there are conflicts, pairings, that can be eliminated by minor adjustments. And if so, we'll do that. But this is the last thing on our list, and it takes a lower priority than anything else. I just left in the sentence about not being drawn with the intent to protect or defeat an incumbent, and left out that business about not paying attention to incumbents until the end, because I hope they will pay attention from the beginning. Let me skip political parties for a moment and just jump to competition. Competition was a key principle that Governor Jesse Ventura, who was elected in 1998 and was in office in 2001 when we did our redistricting for that decade. he wanted to have a competition principle, and his aide, Joe Mansky, who is one of my co-plaintiffs, wrote the language. You'll see a version of that language here. The court declined the invitation to add a competition principle because it did not want to get involved in any kind of partisan politics if it didn't have to. But the Minnesota Senate did pass a bill to create an advisory commission in 2009, and it had the competition language in it. And we have something on a numbering scheme. Turning to political parties, that's the stuff that's really new. There's been so much effort spent this decade on finding ways to combat partisan gerrymandering. And a number of people have put forth language that would do that. And this first sentence is something that I kind of negotiated with my friends at Common Cause and the League of Women Voters to deter partisan gerrymandering. And in the complaint in February, I had a second sentence that talked about how you measure it. That is, what resources you use. But for this one, I thought I would add a different sentence. Throughout the old one, added this one, a new standard for judging a plan that says it should make it more likely than not that the political party whose candidates receive a plurality of the statewide votes for seats in a legislative body will win a plurality of seats in the body. You get more votes, you win more seats. Seemed like a reasonable proposition to me, very commonsensical, and so I threw it in here. And the legal underpinning of this language, all of it, is described in my summary of the bill, subdivision 10, which is on page 7 of the summary. So those are my principles, and we'll see how the maps and the reports help a reader to determine whether the map follows the principles. Now I've got two sets of maps. One, the base map from 2020, the map actually used in the 2020 election and the previous decade. And the second is my proposed map for 2022. The role of the base map in this series is like the role of a benchmark plan in Voting Rights Act jurisprudence. In the Voting Rights Act, if you're challenging a plan, you have to first show what does the benchmark plan look like. You take the old district boundaries that have been in effect for a decade, and you apply the new population counts to those boundaries and see what the impact on the minority populations that are being protected is. And then you measure any new plan against that benchmark to see whether it is making the minority population better off or worse off than it was before. Well, for some of the same reasons, I create this base map. This one is 2020 using the 2019 population estimates. And what does the map show? Well, it shows the kinds of things that you would think it would show, which is district boundaries in, shaded, and then has information on the county boundaries and names and the city and town boundaries and names. And if you zoom in, you can see them perfectly clearly. Zoom into 200%, you can see them perfectly clearly. Then the district labels have information, the number of the district, then the number in red is the population deviation. That's the challenge that's presented by this plan. Got to add 41,000 people to District 7 in order to equalize the population. In District 6, you're going to have to subtract about 22,000 people to equalize the population. So you can see quickly that the problem is that these 3 districts in the 4 corners of the state all have to get larger because they are underpopulated, whereas these 5 districts in and around the metro area are all overpopulated. Population is moving from the Republican-dominated districts to the Democratic-dominated districts. How do I know what's Republican-dominated and what's Democratic-dominated? That's this third number, the number that's in blue, the percentage number. That's the district's partisan lean as measured by my partisan index that I'll explain a little bit later. So the way I've got it constructed, a positive number, like for Ilhan Omar or Betty McCollum, a positive number is a Democratic favored district, whereas a negative number, like for Tom Emmer, is a Republican favored district. That's how I can see quickly, these are the Republican districts with the minus numbers, and these are the Democratic districts with the plus numbers in their blue percentages. Second way to enlighten us on what the current plan does, what the base plan looks like, is this report that most of you have never seen before. It's called a swing to lose pendulum. It's an idea that I was given by a lady named Jenny Newton Farrelly, who is longtime nonpartisan staff for the Parliament of South Australia. They use that, she invented it, she uses it to measure the competitiveness of plans with a goal toward making plans in Australia where the party that wins a majority of the vote is most likely to win a majority of the seats. And unlike us, they don't wait 10 years to redraw their boundaries. They redraw their boundaries before every election. They redraw them with a purpose of making them competitive as much as possible so that the popular will determine who controls the legislature in the parliament in South Australia. So what this does, to get the swing to lose, you just divide the partisan lean in half and say that if half of the voters decide to go the other way, then the incumbent's probably going to lose. Doesn't make much difference for Ilhan Omar or Betty McCollum because they're so far off of the even mark that they're not going to lose. They have safe seats, I would call them. 20% or more winning margin and 10% or more swing to lose. The most interesting districts are the four at the bottom here. This group of 4% and below are all in districts where the race is close enough that it's about the margin of error. An ordinary poll, I think, in the congressional district does well if it can have a margin of error down around 4% or even a little bit less. So these are districts where you can hardly tell in advance who's going to win. And in fact, in the 10 years that this plan has been in effect, each of these four districts has flipped parties once. The districts in between here, not safe, not competitive, they might swing. And Michelle Fishback was able to defeat Colin Peterson in 2020 in a district with a swing to lose of about 9%, because he was winning in a Republican district for decades. She finally beat him. So that's the lay of the land. This is a 4-4 plan that could become, with a 4% swing toward the Republicans, could become a 6-2 Republican plan, or with a 3% swing toward the Democrats, could become a 6-2 Democratic plan. Very competitive plan. I mentioned the competitiveness principle that Jesse Ventura pushed in 2001. He also wanted to have a way to measure that. And the Minnesota legislature contracted with Caliper Corporation in 2001 to create what we call a competitiveness report that took a look at the votes in each district and determined who had the plurality, this top number, how many are likely to be won by each party. And then it counted the number of competitive districts with 8% or less being competitive, and the number of safe districts. And it used a different number from this 20% as safe, but the idea was the same. They had these counts. Well, that's what we had in 2001. But the Minnesota legislature has contracted this decade with Caliper to add more information to that report and call it a partisanship report. And the primary things that are added are these several measures: mean median gap, lopsided wins gap, declination, and efficiency gap, some of which you've never heard of before and don't quite understand. But let me tell you that for all these measures, the ideal is 0, and they can be either a positive or a negative number, depending on which party they may favor. And the way this table is set up, where you have a positive number, that is a bias against Democrats, a bias in favor of Republicans. So all 4 of these measures show that the plan is biased against Democrats. These are measures that have been around for a while. The mean median gap has been around for more than 100 years to measure things like fermentation time of beer in brewing vats. But they've been used in this last decade for measuring redistricting plans, partly because a group at Tufts, organized by Professor Moon Duchin, has spent a lot of time looking for different ways to measure. And in the many lawsuits, primarily in the second half of this last decade, they use these measures in different ways in different lawsuits to show a partisan bias. So these reports are each available in separate reports in the current edition of Maptitude for Redistricting, but Minnesota has put them all onto one page here. As I mentioned, we have the Democratic plurality. It's simply starting with a Democratic index number and subtracting the Republican index number. So 44 minus 49 is a -5, 48 minus 46 is a +2, and so forth. Just rounding this number to the nearest whole number. And why did I put the Democratic number as the one, as sort of the top number? It's because in the elections measured in this last decade, the Democrats have come out ahead, 51% to 44%. So more districts are likely to be positive numbers than negative numbers. There's a total of 35 million votes in this index, almost 35 million. And you can see the races involved here. 5 general elections during the last decade, and it's 14 races selected from those possible contests. Standard incumbents report, no incumbents paired because this is the current plan. Population summary report has those same numbers as you saw on the map, plus additional statistics about the overall range and the deviations. You've seen that kind of report before. A second report that the Minnesota legislature paid for in 2001 was a report on minorities. How did the minority populations tally up in each of the districts in a plan? And we said, let's take those dozens or hundreds, 264 different categories of race and ethnicity, and just boil them down to a limited number. We got Black, Indian, Hispanic, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and Indian, and other, and then just total them. So we get a rough idea of what's going on. And we created this box up at the top to display any district that had 30% or more total minority, on the theory that if you didn't have a district where there was at least 30% total minorities, even if they all cooperated with each other and voted for the same candidate, they were not likely to have control over electing representatives of their choice. None of the districts in the current plan meet that threshold. The highest district is 29%, just a little bit below the threshold. And that turns out to be District 5. That's Ilhan Omar's district. And you all know that she won in 2018 and she's was successful again in 2020. Obviously, not just because of the vote that she got from any of these minorities communities or even all together, but because she also appealed to plenty of white voters as well. Contiguity report is a pass-fail. This number should always be 0. It's a curiosity that in this particular plan, the current plan, there is one non-contiguous district. It's a result of an annexation where a city in District 6 annexed a portion of a township that was in District 3 and left a little piece of a non-contiguous territory there. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. It's an illegal plan. The usual report on political subdivision splits. I think anybody who's run a splits report before has seen something like this. Measures of compactness. Oh, there's always another measure of compactness. Last decade we have 8. This decade we have 13. New ones include the number of cut edges and the minimum convex hull and the alternate Schwarzberg. And no one measure is definitive. And it's often that one plan will beat another on some of these measures, but not on others. I've arranged the measures so that the ones where a higher number is better are all on the left, and where a lower number is better on the right. And the ones that run faster are on the left. These only take a couple of seconds. These two take a minute or so, and this one takes up to 3 minutes. Communities of interest report can be run on any layer that is in your redistricting database. And one layer that is in the census file is American Indian reservations. So it's one that's easy to run a communities of interest report on. The report from 10 years ago looked a lot like this. The report that I started with a week ago didn't look a lot like this. So I had to go in and modify it to make it look like it did 10 years ago, to simplify it. This is all the information I think that you need to see whether plan splits a particular community of interest unduly. You can also ask that it report all the districts, even those that are not split. So that's the set of reports on the base plan. Any questions about that before we get into the proposed plan? Anything come up there, Ben, in the?
No, you're answering all the questions, Peter. Nothing so far.
Okay, okay.
Good.
So this is the proposed plan, the 2022 plan. And how do you know what the difference is between this and the base plan? Well, to see the district boundaries have changed, I put in this little red line that shows the current district. So you can see instantly that those, whatever it was, 36,000 people that District 8 needed to pick up were picked up by picking up all of Lake of the Woods County, all of Beltrami County, and a few townships in Clearwater County. And the 41,000 people that District 7 had to pick up were primarily by adding this eastern portion of Stearns County, which includes the city and suburbs of St. Cloud, was able to drop off a couple of counties over here. Now, how is the deviation? Well, District 8 is off by 7 people. That's not 7%, that's 7 people. District 7 is off by 199 people. And that is with using whole cities. I think it's a good thing to keep the cities whole, and is worth having a little bit of deviation if you can do that. It is a deterrent, among other things, to gerrymandering. You see the population that was added, and you can see in here population that was subtracted. Dean Phillips' district gives up these western cities from his district, and some of them going to District 6 and some going to District 2. So that's oh, and if you remember all of those partisan leans from the other map, you'll see that these haven't changed very much. There is some change, but it's not very much. To take a closer look at the proposed plan, we'll zoom in here and see that Omar and McCullum are still way up here. They're safe. Emmer and Fischbach are still in this band, still relatively safe. The one significant change is that Dean Phillips has moved from 4% where he's competitive to 5% where less so. not really competitive, a little bit more secure there. And Jim Hagedorn has moved down a notch or two so that he is a little bit more competitive. Like the base plan, this is a 4-4 plan. But for it to become a 5-3 plan would require a Republican swing of only 1% to knock out Angie Craig. And it would require a Democratic swing of only 2% to knock out both Hagedorn and Stauber and make it a 6-2 Democratic plan. Very sensitive to the political winds that could be blowing in 2022. The Partisanship Report looks a lot like what you saw with the base plan, and in order to tease out the differences, I have another report at the end of this list that compares them number by number. We'll kind of skip over to that then quickly. I was able to draw a plan that did not pair any incumbents. When you're doing a new plan and can compare it to your base plan, you can get some sense of the extent to which the new plan preserves the cores of prior districts. And you do that by measuring a couple of things, both total population and the voting age population. The proxy I have for that is the number of voters at the 2020 election. We'll get the voting age population with the census in August or September. So how do you read this report? Well, this is on the plan 2022 HC03. This plan compared to the 2020 base plan. You can see that in District 1, 96% of the voters and 96% of the total population came from the old District 1. So 96% of the core of the prior district. 95% in District 2, 95% in District 3. It's not until you get down to District 6 that you see it's only 78%. And District 7 is 83%. That's what brings the overall number down to 93%. And we'll see how that compares with what the court did 10 years ago. A second method for measuring preservation of the cores of prior districts, for measuring least change, is just count the number of people who are moved from one district to another. That's a statistic often cited in court cases when they're looking at the disruption caused by a plan. Where do you get that number from? Well, you just take these little pieces, the 26,000 people here, this 27 and 292 and 10,000 people there. You add up all of these parts that were not in the district before, and you say those people have been moved to a new district, and that's your number, 437,000 people. I will be very curious to see how the plans proposed by others do at keeping that number down and keeping this number up. Population summary shows that this is not a one-person up or down plan, but I'm going to try to persuade the court that it's worth it to be able to keep whole cities. Although depending on how the populations come out in August, it may not be possible to get this close with the particular populations that we have. We'll see. Contiguity, this one passes the test. And the splits, you can see no city splits, only counties. The measures of compactness numbers are hard to evaluate in this form. They look about the same, but I have a later report that compares them number by number. And the communities of interest report looks about the same as regards how it treats Indian reservations. So this is the comparison report that I was talking about. Unfortunately, this is one that I've had to do by hand, and I've been doing it since 2001. So I had this information already. And added to it the information from the 2020 base plan and my 2022 proposed plan. So we can look across and see how things have gone. Obviously, my 1654 is way up compared to the one person in the court's plans. And I'm about the same with counties as the court has been, both in number of counties and the number of times split, but I don't split any precincts, any cities, and I don't split any precincts, unlike the court. Here are those compactness measures I talked to you about. By lining them up in this kind of a comparison report, you can see much more easily how things compare. And what you'll see is that where higher is better, in some cases, my numbers are not quite as good as what the court has been, but in other cases, they're a little bit better than what the court has. And overall, I'd have to concede that the court plan is probably a little more compact than my proposed plan. We're the same on Indian reservations. I do a little bit better, 1% better on cores of prior districts than the court did in 2012. I don't bear any incumbents, they paired too. For the partisan information, one of the interesting things to look at is how the partisan relationship between Republicans and Democrats and third parties has changed over the decades. This is 20 years worth of change. From 1998, we see that the Republicans actually had an advantage in the party index created that decade, 46 to 45. But we can see that each year, it moved 10 years, and they lost 1% going to 2012, and they lost another percent going to 2020. Whereas the Democrats picked up 3% in 2012 and picked up another 3% going from 2012 to 2020. Part of that change in both parties is attributable to the fall from the high of 9% in the year Jesse Ventura was elected as a third party governor, down to 7% and then 6%. You can see the other numbers are pretty similar across the board here. And when you get down to these partisan bias numbers, they're pretty similar across the board, except for declination. I don't know why it was so different in 2012 from the others. And the efficiency gap was a little different in 2012. Anyway, that's it. That's what I've got in the way of maps and reports, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Do you mind stopping sharing your screen just so I can get the get all the questions and stuff back? All right, there we go. Perfect. So we got one question here that was direct message to me. So just let me pull it up 1 second. So the question is, how did you finalize the wording of your partisan fairness provision of the criteria? In particular, how did you decide on the intent or effect language? Most states with similar criteria focus only on intent.
That was in a negotiation with the League of Women Voters over the language. And they thought it was really important to talk about effect as well as intent. And I said, okay, it was a compromise. No, I didn't start with effect. I didn't start with that. But that's where I ended up in the negotiation. And I'm sticking with it.
All right, good. So yeah. So another question is, let me just pull it up. Have you ever worked with other kinds of software before? Do you know if the reports that other vendors software produce are similar to the one you just walked through on Maptitude?
I can tell you a little bit of my history. So the answer is yes.
Okay.
A little bit of my history. I started drawing maps as legal descriptions of the legislative plan in 1971. And when the 1980s rolled around, I thought I would like to make life easier. And so I would like to produce some maps and some reports. And we contracted the Minnesota legislature with a company called Apt Associates to build us an electronic system. And I wrote the specifications for the maps and the reports that were to come out of that system. Minnesota was the first state in the nation to digitize its redistricting geography statewide. Did that in 1980. In 1990, Apt Associates had been driven bankrupt with the cost of trying to meet our requirements. So they went out of business, but ESRI was in business. They were just getting into the redistricting business. And we contracted with them to produce our maps and reports. And I wrote the specifications for those as well, and had long negotiations with Jerry Clancy and Earl Nordstrand and others at Esri over exactly how they should be formatted and what they should show. And I believe that a number of other people saw those specifications and saw those reports and copied them. So I think you'll find reports coming out of Esri, and maybe that includes Autobound. I don't know. I think you'll find that many of the reports are similar to what you've seen. But on the other hand, I haven't seen anybody other than Jenny Newton Fairley in Australia with a swing to lose pendulum. And I haven't seen anybody anywhere with a partisanship report that has all of those different measures of partisan bias together on one page. You won't find that anywhere else.
Right. Oh, you're done. Okay.
If I had my way, they would all be available via Maptitude, at least to everybody. But currently, the partisanship report and the minority population report are special deals for Minnesota, and I don't know what you need to do in order to be able to get reports like that for your state.
Understood. Are there any? I mean, you showed the compactness report that had all of those scores. It's a little overwhelming, and you're correct that they, just looking at the numbers, they seem to be somewhat nonsensical if you were trying to look at them in the aggregate. Are there tests that like you've used in the past that you prefer, or is it just I use REAC because REAC comes first and is more common?
Yes.
Yeah.
I love REAC and Polsby Popper and Maximum Convex Hull because they're instant. You push a button and they're all done. And running most of the others, if you just leave out the two population, circle and population core or whatever it is, leave out the two populations in the Ehrenberg, you can do the whole thing in about 2 seconds. All of it. So.
Got it. Okay, great. That was the last question that was direct message to me. I think just one question I have is when you are looking at the partisanship tests, a lot of these are, as you mentioned, are relatively new. Some of which I understand fairly well, like mean median and the efficiency gap, some of which I do not understand as well, like declination. When you are, or have you like determined on your own which tests work best? Are there like tests that work better in certain circumstances more so than others? I can imagine that some tests statistically might be more applicable in certain situations than others, but I also don't know if that's a good way to conceptualize an analysis of partisan breakdown across different areas of geography.
Like with the compactness measures, I take them all of the bias measures with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
No one is definitive and you just can't be sure and so forth. And what the courts did in those decisions in the last half of this past decade was they looked at the results of all those various tests, and what the judges often said was, it's not any one report that tips us in this direction. It's the fact that all the reports point in the same direction. All the measures say that this plan is biased. If there are some going the other way, then the courts say, well, you can't tell anything. So I don't put a lot of stock in any of them, except where they do all tend to lean in the same direction.
Got it. Understood. Great. Well, Peter, I don't see any other questions. So if you want to stay on, folks, just know that you can always reach out to Peter directly. I'm sure that he'd be happy to talk with you. And if you'd like, you can also send questions to us and we'd be happy to send them to Peter later on your behalf. But Peter, that was very informative. I learned a lot, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you,
Yeah.
Christy, for making. I'm
Yes,
looking
thank
forward
you.
to hearing something from Kim.
Yes, so